Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Persist Series, Discovery's monthly conversation series to help women in engineering and tech build community and thrive in their careers. I'm Gayatri Shukla, founder of Campfire Kinship, and I'm thrilled to be your host for the 2022 series. You might remember me from the 2021 episode titled From Mindset to Management. I had the pleasure of sharing my story as an engineer and how that led me to my passion for helping organizations create diverse and inclusive cultures where employees can bring their authentic selves. Much of that has to do with storytelling. I believe you get to write the chapter of your own story. That means both unlearning the myths you've been told just so you can survive and owning the truth of your potential to thrive. So, shameless plug, feel free to give that episode a watch. And in the meantime, I can't think of a better way to kick off our 2022 series than along the lines of surviving to thriving. This year, we'll be talking all about creating change to help women in engineering and tech reach their fullest potential. We'll reimagine what's possible for women in the profession to move their experiences beyond just surviving and cultivate a welcoming culture that nurtures career thriving. I'm excited to launch our first episode during Engineers Week, when people around the globe are honoring how engineers make a difference in our world and are having critical conversations about the future of the field. As your host this year, I look forward to keeping these conversations going to help shape the inclusive organizations that engineering and tech professions need to do its best work. To get us started, we're kicking off the series with Dr. Juliana Gissoon, whose research is paving the way toward a thriving workforce at a critical point in the engineering career among undergraduate students. Let's go. I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's featured speaker, Dr. Juliana Gissoon. Juliana is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of New Hampshire, where she's continuing her work to challenge the assumption that helping engineering undergraduate students cope with cultural and systemic barriers is enough to facilitate their long-term success in the career. So what does it take to help engineering students thrive? What does engineering thriving look like along the career trajectory, and how can we cultivate it? What skills and competencies can help us not just navigate challenges, but actually function optimally in our careers? We'll dig into all these questions and more to take a look at the bright spots and the blind spots for moving toward a more inclusive culture where young professionals can not only just survive, but thrive for the long term in engineering and tech careers. I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Juliana Gissoon.
My name is Juliana Gissoon, and I'm a creator. I create knowledge through research, I create experiences for students through teaching, and I create new relationships through mentorship and collaborations. Today, I want to share more about how I became the person I am today. During my first day as an undergraduate engineering student, I sat in a crowded lecture hall of over 200 people, 3 of which were women. I watched as my instructor remarked the classic, "Look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you 3 will survive in engineering." He was right. Only a third of students actually graduate with an engineering degree in 4 years. This is half the graduation rate of all college majors in the country and leads to a projected shortage of over 2 million qualified candidates for engineering-related jobs by 2025. But I wasn't just an engineering student. I also studied human development and family studies. For contrast, I would proudly sit in a crowded lecture hall of over 200 students, of which there was 3 men. And just as much as I enjoyed seeing more women in my classes, I also learned to approach my experiences in engineering from a social science perspective. More specifically, I paid attention to the multiple personal, cultural, and contextual factors that work together to affect human development. To give some examples, first, by personal context, I mean the conversations that people were having with each other. There were many times where I overheard students talk about, I haven't slept all week because I had 6 exams this week, and then I stayed up all night scrolling social media because I was so burned out. It seemed like stress, anxiety, and depression was so common to what we talked about in engineering that became the focus and reality for a lot of people. Next, I also want to talk about the context of engineering and how that shapes into the experiences of many engineering students. During finals week, I will walk around campus and I would see the shuttles that take students around campus would say the struggle bus. And I think that was an interesting message to give to the community during finals week. Similarly, when I walked in the hallways, I saw a lot of posters on the walls that said, "Are you stressed? Talk to a therapist on campus." Or, "Are you feeling suicidal? Call these hotlines." While these resources are helpful and important, the message is also clear that many are suffering. While these are my experiences in engineering for the context and the conversations that people were having with each other, the culture of engineering also were pretty salient to me. I remember being told when I was struggling to figure out a math problem, talking to myself, obviously frustrated, frazzled, scratching my head. I remember being stared at and then being told, well, I thought people like you should be good at math and quieter. And in the times where I did talk about instances of bias that I had experienced, I was often told, well, you're a woman of color and you're just going to have to deal with it. And while these are my personal experiences in engineering, what we know from the peer-reviewed literature is that engineering culture has been described as suffering a shared hardship with a lot of discrimination and being problem-focused and full of challenges. And with all these influences from the personal perspective, the context, and the culture of engineering, it's not a huge surprise that the graduation rate is only 30%, four-year graduation rate for engineering students, whereas the national graduation rate across all college majors is 60%. I want to highlight that there's been a lot of great research and interventions to address the high stress, anxiety, depression, and suffering we often see within engineering. However, I wanted more in my life as an undergraduate engineering student than to suffer less. I became curious about the vision for engineering and engineers in the absence of suffering, and I wanted an identity for myself as a future engineer and for the whole field of undergraduate engineering that was beyond suffering less or fixing problems that went wrong in life. Thus, I pursued my PhD to develop the concept of thriving in engineering. I was on a mission to shift the narrative in engineering from surviving to thriving. Now, before I dive into my research, I want to highlight 2 statements from prior research. The first is that poor academic performance is not the primary reason students leave engineering. As we discussed earlier, the conversations that people are having, what we focus on in our context, environment, and what is the embedded biases and structures of the culture all play a role. And second, helping people suffer less doesn't imply that they will thrive. We know from the Yerkes-Dodson stress performance curve that a life without stress is often described as boring or empty, and thus results in low performance. On the other hand, having too much stress leads to distress, which also results in low performance, as well as anxiety and having trouble functioning. However, in the middle is this optimal level of eustress, in which people can function at their best and have enough stress to motivate them to perform. So for my research, I developed a model of thriving for engineering students. My research has shown that there are 3 major components to thriving, which are broadly categorized by internal, external, and cultural context factors. Let's start with the external thriving outcomes, which are defined as not being in anyone's direct control, and for students, could include things like grades or personal interactions with others. For example, I could study as hard as I can and pour all my time and effort in going to class and making sure I understand the material, but that doesn't guarantee I get the grade that I want. Similarly, I can smile at everyone I see all day, but that doesn't guarantee that all my interactions with other people will be positive. Sadly, so much of the traditional success metrics in engineering hinges on performance, and that can be a great source of stress for people because it's outside of our direct and immediate control. I would recommend don't focus on anything that's in the external outcomes. It's not worth our focus, time, or energy, because worrying about the future or regretting the past takes a tremendous amount of energy and adds nothing positive or productive to life. My research shows that thriving is a cyclical process rather than a linear path. Thus, when I receive the outcome that I want, I enjoy it because my story goes on. And when I receive the outcome that I didn't like, I know that there's valuable lessons here, and that will help me navigate the rest of my story. Next, I'll talk about internal thriving competencies, which reside within the person and includes examples such as reflection, sense of meaning, curiosity, and emotions. While we're all affected by the cultural and systemic factors in the environments that we reside, we don't have to be the victims to our surroundings. Out of the three categories that I'm talking about today, I am in most direct and immediate control over my internal state of being. When it comes to thriving, this means that my interpretations are in my control, even if the external circumstances and my outcomes are not. For example, when I was told that I just had to put up with injustice in engineering because I'm a woman, at first I felt my stomach tense in anger. And then I boiled, I was hurt, I was uncomfortable. I didn't like to feel less than in any way. Rather than flipping the table, which I did think about, I noticed my discomfort in my body, and eventually my shoulders relaxed, my stomach unclenched, and that discomfort passed. And I was able to have a different experience in my own self and in my body about what had happened. And it's in that space with a new perspectives that I realized how utterly isolated and lonely some people can be, such that they can't help but speak in ignorance due to their own limited experiences. Having this new frame of reference and a new interpretation for what happens to me helps me take action that is more productive and positive and aligned with the outcomes that I want in my life. So a key takeaway for internal thriving competencies is that everything I experience is temporary and things are constantly changing. Thus, I thrive when I realize that it's not a goal to achieve, but a constant process of navigating the changes in life. Next, I want to talk about the cultural and systemic factors, which affect the relationships between the internal and external factors. Some examples of cultural and systemic factors are things like implicit biases or stereotypes in engineering. For example, two students with similar academic performance, which would be an external outcome, can have vastly different experiences of belongingness or inclusivity in engineering, which are two internal experiences. On the other hand, two students could have similar levels of internal thriving, such as being very interested and motivated to do well on an exam and both study very hard, but can end up with different academic performances, which are external outcomes. And that could be due to biases in the assessments. So what does this mean for improving the culture of engineering? Well, my research shows that truly diverse and inclusive environments stem from an awareness and appreciation of individual differences. As diversity becomes more of a focus in recruiting, it's important to remember that we women weren't hired just so we can become men. Rather, we come to be ourselves, use our own minds, and contribute perspectives that will be acknowledged and appreciated. We know from the literature that culture change is very slow. While there are policies and practices that we can all implement to incentivize certain more helpful behaviors, a truly diverse and inclusive environment is the result of collective thinking. We are all part of culture change. And I like to illustrate that with an anecdote. I've talked with a lot of undergraduate engineering students, and I would ask the question, what would help you thrive in engineering, and how can we create a culture of thriving in engineering? Oftentimes I hear from the students, well, I'm at mercy of the grades from my faculty members. So if you could change them a little bit, that would help a lot. Also, I need to go through the staff to get a lot of administrative tasks done. So if you could change the staff a little bit, that would help me thrive a lot and help the culture of engineering thrive. Next, I talk to faculty members, same question, and the faculty would say, well, I depend on my students for positive reviews on teaching evaluations so that I can get promoted. And I also rely on the staff to get a lot of my administrative tasks done. So if you could change the students or change the staff just a little bit, then we could all thrive more. Next, when I talk to the staff, same question, how can we help engineering thrive? I get feedback along the lines of, well, I'm at mercy to the students and the faculty who asked us to do so many things. So if you could change the students or change the faculty, then we would all be thriving. The moral of the story is that we are all part of this culture change. And the more thriving that we can cultivate in ourselves, then that little bit more thriving we can share with each other. And collectively, that's how we can create a culture of thriving. Along the theme of this Discovery Persist series, a key question is, why do I stay? I stay because I believe helping more engineering students thrive is a win-win-win-win situation. The first win is for engineering students. In 2018, I designed and taught a course on thriving for undergraduate engineering students. And the students who learned the skills to thrive in my course also improved in virtually every success metric, such as grades, persistence, teamwork ability, satisfaction, and health. The second win is institutions. We know from other institutions that have taught courses on general human thriving or flourishing, they were able to show that over time, the alumni who learned to be more grateful or more mindful were willing to donate more back to the institution, as well as dedicate more of their own time to engage with future cohorts of students and help them succeed and thrive just as they have been. And that's a huge benefit to institutions. The next win is with recruitment and outreach. In 2019, I was invited to give a keynote speech at a conference in Boston University regarding improving STEM outreach. Oftentimes, we discuss the messaging of engineering as masculine or full of hardship was discouraging for students, especially girls, and discouraged them from pursuing engineering. There were national level recommendations to change these stereotypes and especially the messaging about STEM to make them more of an attractive and inspirational option that can make the world a better place. The fourth win is society at large. As we know from Gallup polls, students who learn to thrive in college are also likely to thrive after college. When it comes to engineering, do you want surviving or thriving engineers to design your medical equipment or bridges or phones? Given this win-win-win-win situation, I stay because I want to not only increase the number of engineering graduates, but also the quality of their work and personal experiences in engineering. As we see, supporting more engineering students to thrive is an investment in a better future for you, me, and society at large. With my research, the 600,000 engineering students around the country would walk into their first engineering lecture and learn about thriving without the fear of barely surviving.
Have you ever felt like you were just surviving? What does thriving look like for you? Juliana and her colleagues will be joining us in a moment to continue this conversation. So be ready to submit your questions using the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. See you soon.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Happy National Engineers Week. I'm Carol Smith. I'm an electrical engineer at UL, a global testing, inspection, and certification company. It's my honor to serve as the moderator for today's Q&A session with our featured speaker, Dr. Juliana Guswin, and our esteemed panelists. Following brief introductions, we'll get right to the Q&A portion of our session today. Juliana, would you please start off by introducing yourself to everyone live?
Absolutely. I am Juliana Guswin. I'm currently a postdoctoral diversity and innovation scholar at the University of New Hampshire, and I create knowledge to shift the narrative from surviving to thriving in engineering.
Thank you, Juliana. Let's go next to Allison. Please introduce yourself, Allison.
Everyone, I'm an associate professor in engineering education and chemical engineering at Purdue University. And my research focuses on how students develop identities as engineers and how that impacts decision-making into college, into engineering majors, and then after university education. And I also kind of study pieces of belonging as connected to identity in that work.
All right, excellent. Matilde.
Yes, hello, my name is Matilde Sanchez Peña, an assistant professor of engineering education at the University at Buffalo. And my research is focused on understanding how those cultures of health and well-being can have a place in engineering, and how we measure the assessment, the gains in equity, inclusion, and diversity in engineering.
All right, thank you, Matilde. And last but not least, Stephanie, please introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, my name is Stephanie. I work at the University of Connecticut, or UConn. I'm in biomedical engineering, and I'm also in our Institute for Inclusion. A lot of my work is with developing programs and how looking at the impact of what they do on various populations, from K-12 students to undergrads to grad students to faculty. Happy to be here, everybody.
Excellent. All right, we're going to get right to the questions next. And the first question, I'm going to direct this one to you, Allison. We hear a lot about how women who develop an engineering identity stick around in the profession a lot longer. How can instructors, parents, and staff support engineering students to better develop their identity? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's good. So when I think about identity, I think about it as seeing yourself as the kind of person who can do engineering or who can be an engineer. And thinking about that, it really involves core questions of who am I more broadly, and does this fit with me? Who can I become? So is this part of the pathway that I'm on, and do I belong? And so in addressing those kind of core ideas, one of the things that's come up over and over again is this idea of recognition as particularly important for early career students and early career professionals, that getting messages from important others like family, like professors or instructors, like your peers, that you care about, so that they see you as the kind of person that can do engineering, really impacts that sense of self as an engineer. And so when we think about how do you support an engineering identity, I think that's one of the key ways is to start to provide opportunities for recognition that look different than the traditional norms in engineering, where someone's sitting on the front row and they're the one who always raises their hand first, but actually looking for contributions more broadly, and then recognizing those as valuable contributions to engineering as a whole.
All right, thank you. Is there anything else one of you would like to add to that? No? All right, let's move on. And I'll open this up to whoever wants to speak to it. What other attributes do you think can help more women and underrepresented racial ethnic groups belong and thrive in STEM fields and careers?
I'll jump in here. And I really like this question because it points to, well, it points to a lot of different things. So when you talk about, or you ask about the attributes that can help women and underrepresented minorities, you're looking at the lens of what should women and underrepresented minorities do? And there's the other lens as well, as what will the existing structures, people, or places do as well. So from the point of, for example, what can help, what does that environment look like? And for example, you might think about, say, microaggressions. Microaggressions are, if you haven't heard the term, they're slights. They could be verbal, it could be environmental, but they really hurt, and they can take seed in biases or stereotypes. But there's statements like, oh, you speak English very well, or you're too pretty to be an engineer, or some of those things. There's lots of different types of microaggressions, but a lot of people say that the environment, which could include microaggressions, is really toxic or not helpful. So what are ways that we can make that better so that people feel, I guess, points of belongingness and other things in that space?
Okay. I'm gonna ask you, Dr. Juliana, when you developed your course to help people, the students, thrive more, can you give an example of how what you taught them helped them recover quickly from a microaggression or a situation where they maybe felt like they weren't included or accepted for their contributions in engineering or engineering studies?
Absolutely. In the course that I taught on thriving, I talked about multiple aspects of thriving and how they work together to impact our experiences. And much like Stephanie has just shared, a lot of it has to do with the environment and the context of where we belong and what is considered normal or acceptable behavior. And so on that lines, in the course on thriving, we talked a lot about finding community and places where we can be vulnerable with each other to share that we're having these experiences. And that opened up, one, the sense of solidarity, in the sense that a lot of people are going through the same thing. And when it comes to what can we do about it, first of all, speak up is a good start. And if that's not working, find other people to speak up with you, because until we can make certain challenges more known and more visible, they're easy to ignore.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you both for that. This one is for anybody who wants to chime in. How do you effectively deal with sexist feedback during a job interview?
Maybe I'll say a couple of things, right? So I spent a really short time in engineering industry before I stepped back into academia. And I think a lot depends on the power dynamic that you're situated in, and how willing you are to like take that on in the moment. Because sometimes you're just like, I don't want to deal with that. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable and okay response to have in that moment. And then at times you might be like, this needs to be addressed. And if I'm not going to stay here, someone needs to say something, and it might be me. You know, in that point, I usually ask probing questions. So like, rather than directly addressing it head on, I ask questions like, well, why would you give me that kind of feedback? Are there certain kinds of things that you're seeing my colleagues doing that I'm not doing? And when typically folks don't have an answer to that because it's based in sexism and not in actual facts from your performance, you can point that out, and you can start to maybe push on them that the way in which they're evaluating is problematic and it systemically hurts people. And you can bring those conversations up, I think, after you've taken some time to like have them express those positions to you. But again, I think it's okay to just say, I'm not going to have to deal with that today. And if you are in the position where you're like, I just want to walk away and not deal with it, that's perfectly okay. I've got several grad students who are on the job searches right now, and it's like, if it's not a good fit, that's a like red flag to just maybe run the other way, because it's not going to be the first time at that place that that's going to happen if they're doing it that early on in your career.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking. Maybe it's a strong indication that's not the place for you. And perhaps preparing yourself, expecting that there could be questions that are sexist and offensive when you go into the situation, might help you sort of prepare for it before you're in it. All right, this one, I'm going to ask Stephanie to answer this one. Is there any advice on how to find internships or even how to decide on your specific career path coming out of the university?
This is a really great question. And I think there's lots of different ways to approach this. So when you're deciding your career path, there's the question of why. Why are you pursuing what you're doing? So are you pursuing it for the money? Are you pursuing it because there's big job demand? Are you pursuing it because you enjoy it? So lots of things that are personal decisions for you. For me, the advice that I give that really applied to myself is find something that feeds your soul. And if it feeds your soul, it'll feed your mouth and your whole lifestyle. So that is something that I try to lean towards. Now, when you're looking for internships, there's lots of different ways that you could approach this. One could be, let's say you're in an academic or industry setting, seeing if there's labs or people who have connections to, say, an industry-based internship. So lots of people collaborate, and that's a big thing in engineering in particular. So who are folks collaborating with? Because having that person who you can reach out to rather than kind of cold calling or cold emailing is super helpful. So seeing, are there connections that exist that you could leverage to be able to get your foot in the door? And I say this to say that a lot of people say networking is important, but they don't know the underlying tones of the privilege behind a network. So if you don't have that privilege, realizing that you still matter and you can still get that connection, but you might just need to look for different ways or mentors to lift you or people to find you and elevate you to those situations. So lots of people are willing to help. So for example, if you come to me, I will find you a connection, but that's some of the things that people are there for. Other ways to find internships, there are lots of resources that kind of collate them on a particular site. So you might look into sites such as like Handshake is one platform, or there's other platforms at different institutions or places, but they might collate them into one spot. There's also ones that describe opportunities based on affinity. So for example, there's lots of women's-based sites, for example, that might highlight and advertise, okay, here's something that we're looking for. They'll post them, for example, in different newsletters. So you just got to keep your eyes peeled and figure out who can I connect with so that I can get there. And then the last place on finding internships, it's the very small print at the bottom of most companies' websites. There's a link that says careers. And so there, when you click there, they actually open up an entire portal of all of the jobs that are open on their site. And I had no idea this existed until someone else walked me through it. So those are resources that I can think of, but if other folks have anything to add, by all means.
Yeah, would anyone else like to chime in on that? Any other suggestions? No? Okay, let's see what else is in our box here. This one I'm going to direct to you, Matilde. We hear a lot about the importance of and crisis of mental health for STEM students in particular, and the topic still stigmatized. Can you unpack some of the stigma surrounding that and share some evidence-based strategies to combat the stigma and support a culture of well-being?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for posing it in a way of, unpacking, right? Because definitely the issues of mental health and well-being in academic spaces, they have different layers. In particular, the first one is that the general society has an issue of mental health stigma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a thing that is still shown at some points and places, right? Like there are organizations that are moving forward with that goal, right, of removing the stigma from society, right? And in my own research, I have seen like cases where the student actually posts like, well, I know that I have a condition from early on, but then when I seek for support and actual help and service, like they get shunned by their families, which are the ones that held the stigma. So it's really important to start the stigmatizing at the societal level, right? Like, and start having those conversations. And in the second level, of course, is the engineering culture, like as Juliana nicely framed it, right? Like there are many different elements that really deter students from actually seeking the help that they need when needed. Like research also show that like statistically, like engineering students, for example, don't have a higher prevalence of mental health conditions, for example, but they do have a lower, like if they have conditions, they are less prone to seek for help, you know. So like the question remains like, what are the kind of things that we are keep telling to each other that prevents those that need that help from seeking it, right? So in terms of strategies, for sure, like research-based strategies, of course, we need to start normalizing, right? Like there is a number of people starting to having those conversations, starting from the top down, because institutions are aware of these mental health crisis as you frame it, right? And they have resources and things like those. But beyond that, because sometimes the students are like, well, I look for the resource, but like then I get in a waiting list for a long time and everything, right? Like also research has shown that peer support structures are also effective. So, and those are approaches also to start changing the culture little by little, right? Like if like these peer support networks can also help deal with these issues, as well as simultaneously starting changing the conversation. So both students and faculty play a significant role in that, you know. So the normalization, of course, starts by having just like, I have heard from our research participants, right? Like I have a set of slides that discuss the resources and that discuss that these things are important, right? And that should be more prevalent around engineering and other STEM fields, and like in academia in general, right? Like recognizing the relevance of those factors in their success. And in that line, of course, also thinking about behavior modeling, right? Like also how faculty not necessarily like shape the best image of balance or well-being or thriving ourselves, right? And how like little shifts can also help making strides supporting our students and younger generations.
All right, thank you. Okay, this one is for Juliana. Do you have any advice for someone who's been surviving in their career for over 25 years in the engineering industry, and they want to switch to that sort of thriving mentality and mindset? What would your advice to them be?
I would say to start, the engineering industry is essentially built upon looking for problems and fixing them. So in that sense, many engineers are conditioned to focus on what is not working and fix it. And that's fine, but the problem occurs when we start looking for problems in other people, in myself, in the world, and in everything else. Then life becomes all about surviving. And just like it took many years, I think the question said 25 years to condition into this mindset of surviving, we can also start to condition ourselves out of that into a thriving mindset. And I like to give an analogy similar to the first time we walk into a gym, there's no expectation to lift 100 pounds. So as we're working towards more of a thriving view of ourselves and the world, start small. Just start with little pauses throughout the day and think, how am I feeling right now? Is what I'm thinking helpful to my thriving? Is what I'm saying to people in the past or currently helpful to thriving? Is it helpful to myself? Is it helpful to other people? Is it kind? Is it conducive to a more positive culture? Am I starving? Am I well rested? Am I, all of those factors play a part. And I would just recommend starting small, just asking the question, what kind of life do I want to experience? What does it mean to thrive for myself is a great start, and slowly making actions to get there, while recognizing that we're slowly retraining ourselves out of some very deeply ingrained habits.
Wow, I never actually made that connection about how as engineers, we do look for problems. And I remember reading in one of your papers about asset-based competencies as opposed to deficit-based competencies. And it reminded me of the whole Clifton strengths approach, where focus on what you do well and improve upon that and build from that, as opposed to always focusing on what your problems are, where your deficits are, and working on those. That kind of changes your perspective a bit, I think. Would anyone else like to chime in on that? As a someone who's been surviving for decades, how do you change up?
Yeah, I might jump in because I think it links to some of the comments in the chat. One of the things I've appreciated about Juliana's work is that I think she's clearly defined that the skills to survive, which are skills you develop, right? And then this goes along exactly with the analogy she just gave, are not the same skills it takes to thrive. And that for me was like ground shifting, right? Like the way you think about it. And so that same idea of like, you build up skills to lift weights and things like that, right? Long conversations about mental health, especially as it's been historically framed, has been in that deficit mode and that like lack of something. And I do think that when we start talking about like the positive side of that, where you can actually try on behaviors and things that do support are really good. And I think a lot about the, it sounds a little hokey, but we know it works from the research of like the saying is believing or the doing, believing type things. It might feel weird to like say something really positive to yourself or about a colleague, or build those habits and behaviors in early on when you're starting to do that. Just like you get sore muscles in Juliana's analogy, right? When you start lifting weights, but as you practice and do that more and more, it actually becomes a part of like who you are and how you view the world. And it becomes a second nature to help in that. And you'll actually see changes, right? It's not just a like doing, like you're putting it on, it's going to be inauthentic or artificial for the lifespan. It actually becomes part of like who you are and ingrained in the ways you engage in the world.
Yeah.
The other thing is like starting out feels awkward, but maybe just start is the thing that, echoing what Juliana said.
All right, thank you. Let's see. This one's for Stephanie. What are some strategies to develop and teach STEM curricula focused on emotionally intelligent and culturally conscious team and leadership skills?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the environment and why people might stay or why people might leave. And so if you recognize as emotional intelligence as being something important, and realizing that how your position as an individual person and also how you interact with other people and all of these things are important in STEM, then you can begin to move forward. So it's not just about you and your work and the research, but it's also how you interact with others, how you grow with others, and how you work together to meet a common goal. So once you recognize the importance and the value, then you can move forward and say, okay, what can we learn about each other? What can we learn about understanding and celebrating differences? Because everybody is not the same. So everyone approaches things differently. They might problem solve differently. They might have different approaches for, I don't know, anything really that's on the table. And so being emotionally intelligent and recognizing and sensing how people are feeling, because emotions are not absent from the workplace, emotions are not absent from life. So you need to be able to recognize them. You need to be able to recognize them and call them in or call them out and realize that we need to keep them in as something to consider at all times. So that's how you can kind of focus on that. And so, for example, let's say you have a group project, and in this group project, you create a team. Well, before you even start working on the STEM-based problem at hand, how about you define what it means to work together? How about you define what each person's pet peeves are so that you know them ahead of time, and that when you're working together, if someone's pet peeve is like delayed communication or something, then you know how to avoid that. And if something happens, how do you conflict resolve? So those are things that you might be able to do in a STEM-based space, is define kind of the rules of engagement, if you will, and define how we interact with each other and how we respond to each other, so that it's not in crisis mode, if you will, if something happens and now your team is mad at each other and all of these things that are a part of STEM, but really thinking about it and being intentional ahead of time.
Yeah, getting to know who you're working with, getting to know each other first is very important. let's see.
Oh, and I feel like I didn't answer the second part of that question. So talking about cultural consciousness and
Yes,
leadership. So just touching on that really quickly, because I know time is flying. My God.
it is.
But
Yeah.
realizing that when you have members of your team, they bring so much to the table. So they bring their lived experiences, they bring all of their identities, and how does all of that come into play? So one of the things also in that kind of early stages is asking folks, you know, what are you bringing to the table? Who are you? Like, what do you bring in multiple different lenses, and valuing all of it as important. So one of the things to think about, for example, in engineering, a lot of people and historically define engineering to be a very specific skill set or a very specific degree or path, but that's not all that engineering is. And a lot of things historically are either ignored or not counted as engineering. And so how can we actually count and value folks' experiences regardless of where it comes from?
Thank you. Let me see if I can figure this question out. There's a lot of conversation among participants, and we'd like to get all the panelists' perspectives on this. When we talk about diversity, why is the focus on racial, cultural diversity mostly? Diversity is a lot more than just that. Might focusing on just race create tension between different racial groups as opposed to focusing on other types of diversity?
I can start with this. When I hear people talk about tension with different races or different cultures, oftentimes I like to think that tension arises when these differences are perceived as threats or sources of conflict. And thriving, like Allison had pointed out, is more than just the lack of problems. In fact, when talking about the lack of tension in and of itself, that actually sounds like it could be potentially lonely or boring and doesn't necessarily imply the presence of inclusion or thriving. And so I like to say thriving and inclusive environments stem from an awareness of and appreciation of individual differences. And we know that the best solutions often come from taking multiple perspectives. And that can happen when we start seeing the strengths in others and working together towards creating a better product or future. And like Stephanie said, getting to know people as people is really important and can help us combat this idea of differences being sources of tension or conflict.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to ask each of you to share your aha moment leading up to deciding on your career. And we're going to start with you, Matilde.
Sure, I will be happy to. So I think during graduate school, right, like during my time pursuing my PhD, for sure there were a lot of moments of surviving, you know, which made me reconsider, like, no, probably like the faculty life is not for me and things like those. But once I got the opportunity to actually interact with the students and see this is a space of potential impact, of potential positive impact in the students, I think that was the turning point in terms of saying, like, no, I really do want to make my contribution on this space to help the students to make it better, you know, to have better experiences, to learn more efficiently, to have a passion for these things, right? And at the same time, not losing their souls, like, you know, many have done, right? So I think that was my point. It was during grad school, kind of late in it actually, and really, you know, motivated me to keep my research going as well as informing my teaching. And yeah, so.
Okay. All right. What about you, Allison?
I feel like I've had many. I started on a STEM track at a young age from just like a demonstration at a year. And I was like, this is amazing. This is what I want to do. And I was pretty like focused on that for a really long time. And like I said, I ended up in industry for a little bit of time because that was just the straightforward path that I stuck on. And that was at the point, I mean, tying back to our theme about thriving, like I was like, this is good. This is fine. I'm making a great salary. I feel like I'm doing interesting work, and I'm not I'm not excited about doing this job for the next 35 years. And I made this really sharp left turn into academia. And that aha moment for me was the realization that I, as someone who did research in engineering education, and similar to Matilda, I mean, we're in the same field, but, could create new knowledge about how do these things work and for whom, and how do we make engineering as a system more inclusive for more people. That idea of knowledge generation was so exciting, but then actually interacting with the next generation of engineers and getting a chance to have impact there as well in the classroom and in mentoring in other spaces was a really a thrill for me. And it's been a job now. I've been in almost a decade and I love it, right? Like every day's great. And so it is a thriving space for me at this point. And I'm really happy that, I veered off course, which is not my personality. I'm very, stick to it kind of person, but this was the best decision I ever made, was to take this other path.
It's evident that it feeds your soul, Allison. Stephanie, how about you? What was your aha moment?
Yeah, some of the work that Juliana talks about is one of the things related to thriving is about purpose and understanding, am I doing something that makes an impact, or feeling like you're as that being one of your drivers, impact or purpose. And so for me, I found that was one of the things that was really important. And so my aha moment was the definition of the confirmation of all of those things. So I remember very vividly, I started actually in mechanical engineering, and there was a course when I started in undergrad, there was a course where they kind of give you a preview of the next 4 years or 5 years in that major. And at that moment, it was like, absolutely not. No, it was not it. And I think for me, recognizing what doesn't feed your soul is just as important as what does feed your soul. So being able to have that experience that's like, no, and then finding that moment that confirms it for you, so that you don't have that, well, what if this is or isn't the right decision, but rather slow things or small things that confirm, yeah, this is it. And the one quote I remember is that I sought some advice from someone, and they told me the more you learn, the more you can teach others. And so that's why I continued towards grad school. And that was one of the things that really resonated with me, because I wanted to make that impact with other people. But how could I do that if I didn't keep going?
Wow, excellent. And Juliana?
My aha moment came early in college, or I would say probably late in college, when I realized I just could not make sense of why so many students were so passionate about engineering and so dedicated and so miserable at the same time. And just going through the same mentality day after day after day for years. And eventually I decided I wanted more in my life than to suffer less. And I'm sure other people probably do as well. But at the time, I was fighting very strong norms of suffering and hardship in engineering, or at least in undergraduate engineering. And after that, I felt very fortunate to have failed over and over again to convince administrators at the university, or even industry folks that I consulted with, that a thriving environment would be better off for engineering students, institutions, outreach, and society. And that was my aha moment, that I decided I will go and create that research that will then give people resources to talk about thriving and to be able to support a system that finds value in supporting more thriving in engineering.
Wow, that's incredible. I think back to when I was in school, we almost wore the struggles as a badge of honor. And I can remember having a conversation maybe 15 years into my career with it was a colleague. She was a business major. And I made a statement about how, well, back in the day, we engineering students could not stand you business majors because you had Fridays off, no classes, and we're struggling and suffering. And she just kind of looked at me and said, and we always thought you engineering students were stupid for majoring in engineering. I said, wow, that's kind of insulting. And I just kind of walked away thinking about it. But as you practice those habits in college, unless you check yourself or change the mentality from surviving to striving, it will carry right on with you through your career. And then suffering in your job is almost a badge of honor that you just carry. It's like, yeah, I'm suffering, I'm bleeding, my bones are broken, but I'm an engineer, so it's okay. And wow, this is really eye-opening. I'm not sure how we're doing with the time, but I think we're probably probably close to wrapping up. So I'm gonna just ask each of you if you would just, is there any advice? And there's one question that I try not to ignore, those who are parents of young daughters and students. So maybe if you wouldn't mind touching on this as we wrap up. How do you speak to your young daughter in a way that would even spark an interest in engineering and plant a seed at an early age and get that I can thrive, I could love this and make a huge difference in the world? Let's start with you, Matilde. You're muted.
Yes,
Oh, there
yes,
you go.
thank you. This is interesting because I actually have a 2.5-year-old daughter that
Okay.
I would really love to inspire to do something powerful. You know, like last night we were reading a book on the story of Marie Curie. You know,
Yeah.
so I think like in terms of a mindset, I think the concepts of try, fail, try again is healthy to develop, right? Because aligning with the space of thriving, right? Like we need to like failing is not necessarily a bad thing. It's something that helps you learn and grow, right? So I think like at this early stage, that's what I'm trying to promote in their mindset, right? Like trying and failing is all right, learn from it, keep growing, right? Like move forward, explore what you love, right? And I think those are essential for not only engineering, but any STEM career or any academic path, or really like for human growth in general, right? Like they'll become better citizens, better explorers, responsible of their own lives and things like those. So I think I would start in those spaces. And of course, when the age becomes appropriate, trying to have her in extra opportunities and activities that are these nowadays, there are plenty. So
Okay, great. How about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, one of the pieces of advice I got in high school was to pick a career that was appropriate for women. And that was something really hard to hear. And it's because it came from someone I loved. And my advice to you, I guess, would be don't let anyone put shackles, blinders, or boundaries on you. And don't let that person also be yourself. So please fly high. People give you advice all the time, but you never know what that means for you. So make the best decision for you, but also remember to look back within and say, are you putting blinders, boundaries or shackles on yourself?
I love that. Thank you. Allison?
I mean, all of this is such like good advice. Like I was, jotting things down and there's a lot of overlap, but linked to some of the conversation around identity, right? I think there is an uphill battle about stereotypes of who can be an engineer that's baked into society. And as a parent, it's like, there are ways to start to do that, like to combat that, right? So, I think providing role models early is a great one. One of our favorite books to come is Rosie Revere, Engineer, which includes instances of failure and repetition, right? And then ultimately success. I think early it's just showing. And then as girls get older, right, actually talking about stereotypes, talking about how they're overgeneralizations that aren't true, to equip them with skills to push against them. And I also think, two important skills we see for thriving in engineering is a growth mindset, which again is linked to failure and things like that. But, not always praising being smart or some like final outcome, the idea that like you're giving positive feedback for continuing to grow, and that smartness and diligence and those things are developable skills that you have to like work at and grow as you grow. I also think a lot of times, like, girls' toys, right? If you're pushing toys. They don't often encourage things like spatial skills, and it's not as easy as like pink Legos. But there's a lot of great engineering, spatial skills, STEM interest toys out there that you can get a hold of. And there's some great guides on that. One of the ones I look to a lot is out of the School of Engineering Education and the P12 Inspire Research Institute at Purdue. My colleagues have done research on this, and it's on the shopping list every Christmas for us. But yeah, things you can try to do at home to try to push some of those things.
All right, great. And then Juliana, we'll end with you, and please share your final thoughts.
Sounds good. So I do want to reflect a little bit about when talking to young girls about thriving, and to pay attention about what we point out to her. Like, are we saying things like, oh, your room is messy, your toys are not cleaned up, your math problem is wrong? Or are we pointing out, I'm proud of your hard work solving that math problem. I'm proud of you fitting all your toys and shoes and clothes in this small space in ways that actually work. So just paying attention to what we focus on is a great place to start. And as a final thought, I'm really honored to be here for and with so many incredible people who care about thriving, either right here in the present or who are watching this recording. I really thank you for being part of this journey, and we are just getting started.
Wow, thank you, Juliana, and all our panelists. It's a great session. We're out of time. I look forward to seeing you all again on March 16th for our second session, and we'll continue to thrive and encourage others to do so. Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.